Next up, we have Paige Bullington. She's the president and general manager for Blackbaud Healthcare Solutions. Paige will moderate our next session, Mergers and Acquisitions in Philanthropy. And this session will bring content and conversation together that focuses on forward-looking relationships, as well as solution and technology strategies to serve the philanthropic needs of healthcare organizations, particularly focused on systemization and regionalization. So thank you very much, Paige.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Well, I was going to say good late morning, afternoon. I think our panel is between everyone and lunch. But we're talking about mergers and acquisitions, and I feel a little bit like Lisa this morning that 45 minutes is probably not quite enough to dig into that topic, but we're going to do our best. So I'm going to quickly, and I apologize for reading, but I think once I introduced our panelists today, you'll understand why I have a cheat sheet, because we've got quite the esteemed group. So I'm going to introduce Armando Chardiet, Fran Petonic, and Randy Varju. First, I'm going to start with Armando Chardiet is president of Atrium Health Foundation. Armando is a recognized leader in the world of philanthropy and has significant experience in establishing a strong culture of charitable giving. Prior to joining Atrium Health in March of 2017, he was the chair of the Philanthropic Institute at the Cleveland Clinic and was responsible for all philanthropic initiatives and capital campaigns. Fran serves as the SVP for philanthropy at Trinity Health. In her role, Fran leads the efforts to build philanthropy as a critical component of Trinity Health's strategy by partnering with CEOs to create a direct line of accountability between the system office and health ministry chief development officers. Fran has 24 years of experience in philanthropy and is part of Trinity Health for over 10 years collectively. And last but certainly not least, Randy Varju, president of AdvocateAurora Foundations and chief development officer for AdvocateAurora Health. Again, this is why I have my notes, so don't leave anything out. In this capacity, Randy has executive responsibility for the vision, planning, and implementation and management of charitable giving and fundraising for all 27 Advocate and Aurora hospitals and system-wide development initiatives. So please help me welcome Fran, Armando, and Randy. All right, so just to kind of tee up this conversation a little bit, we hosted a summit, Blackbaud and my sort of partners in crime here back in November in Chicago with really kind of the goal to talk about how is this sort of market force kind of phenomena that we're all dealing with around mergers, acquisitions, and there are a lot of different terminologies. Partnerships, how is that impacting our sector, not only on a clinical level, but how is that also impacting all of us that work in philanthropy? Because I'm going to guess, and I'll ask of a show of hands, there's probably one or two groups in here, actually I'll do the reverse, who hasn't been impacted by mergers and acquisitions? So a few. So my guess is, if you haven't yet, it probably might come your way. Maybe not. Not suggesting that it should, but point being, it really is something that's impacting our entire sector. So we felt that it was important to kind of touch on this topic today and then kind of talk through that. You know, and I think some of the stats show that, you know, in 2018, mergers and acquisitions were up about 14.5% year over year. We're expected to see more of that in 2019, so it's not slowing down. And really what I wanted to start with today is to kind of ask the panel to describe how it's impacted them, because I think what's interesting with the systems we have represented, while they're large health systems kind of born out of mergers and acquisitions, they're all very different. And the way that your philanthropy organizations come together or how they're structured look different. So Armando, if it's okay, I'll start with you and kind of give the group in the room a little bit of insight into how this looks in your system.
No, I'd be happy to do that. And but before I do, I should say that Bruce should be up here as part of this panel.
That's right.
I started off in healthcare in 2001. That was my first stint in healthcare. And it happened to be at the Washington Hospital Center many, many years ago. So think about it, 2001, that MedStar health system was a fairly new health system at the time. Philanthropy was absolutely not centralized. The fighting between the hospitals about who owned what prospect was just brutal, brutal. And in that time, Ken Samet was beginning to think about, well, how do we begin to centralize philanthropy? How do we bring all these hospitals in Baltimore and Washington together? And fast forward, we have a highly centralized philanthropic effort due to the leadership of MedStar Health. And just a great testament. But it's a process, and it takes time to make it all happen and to take it to where MedStar has it today. So I've been in Atrium Health for approximately 2 years. I came from working, as mentioned before, into highly integrated health system at the Cleveland Clinic and at Penn Medicine in Philadelphia. So very, very different from Atrium Health. Atrium Health constitutes about a $12 billion health system in North Carolina, South Carolina, and now most recently, talk about mergers and acquisitions, in Georgia. So we are 44 hospitals. Philanthropy is absolutely not centralized at all. What attracted me to this position after working in 2 fairly large and sophisticated health systems with sophisticated fundraising operations was the fact that this was a challenge for me, a professional challenge for me, to see how I could go about integrating philanthropy and moving it forward. So it's going to be a process for us as well. And none of these processes are the same. We have many different hospitals associations within that health systems. We have wholly owned hospitals. We have management agreements with some of the hospitals. So each one is very, very different. And within those 44 hospitals, there's 11 separate foundations. So I'll talk a little bit more later about what I'm doing to move it forward, to hopefully move it step by step towards what I hope to be somewhat more similar to where MedStar is today. But that's going to take a while.
Randy?
So those of you that did not have any effect of merger or acquisition, I've got some photos I can give you, so people that, if you see them in the hallway, you know something's up. It's just one of those warning signs. Advocate's history, and I'm from Legacy Advocate as part of this merger. We'd gone through several integrations of different hospitals. I think when I started there, it was maybe 10 hospitals. And over the years, it was almost as if we were integrating another hospital every year. So we'd developed this pre-flight checklist of due diligence and integration that we'd defined and determined here was the scheduled integration process, and here's everything that we could follow, and here's the value that we can show each of these communities that we were generating. This most recent merger was very different because now you've got 2 strong systems coming together. Suddenly, it's no longer 1 hospital at a time. It's bringing a 12-hospital system together with a 15-hospital system. And every step of the way, as we've grown, it was a full asset merger, full integration of the foundation. So we have one foundation for the Advocate system, and now we also have another foundation for the Aurora system, but they're merged together. And I think the checklist was really thrown out the window because you realize suddenly we're managing a mid-sized organization, and culture is different. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Right. And if you can't establish trust as the basis for a lot of the relationships that you need to have in place, you lose the speed necessary to really deliver. You know, I think when I was listening to the physicians and a lot of the presentations earlier, you hear trust mentioned so often. Well, you don't get to gratitude if you don't have trust. And there's a book that I just read by Stephen M.R. Covey. It's The Speed of Trust. And what they show is that there's actually value that you can drive based on the trust in your culture and the speed you're able to allow then some of those changes to take hold. So those are factors that we're dealing with now. We're a couple days away from the 1-year anniversary of this merger of these 2 large systems in Illinois and Wisconsin with 70,000 team members, 3 million unique patients in a given year. But ultimately, it still comes down to the donor relationships. We somehow have to be nationally recognized, but maintain a regional scope and still be locally present. And how do we structure to do that? And how do we build a culture around excellence, genuine relationships, but still committed to execution? And those are some of the challenges we're facing.
Thank you. Fran?
So being a part of Trinity Health, where I first came into the organization in a single hospital doing major implant gifts, and then left, and then came back and ran a 5-hospital region, and then went to, when I came back with that mandate of doing a regionalization of 5 hospitals, it was that same, how are we going to trust, how are we going to earn respect among each other. And then they said, okay, we'll now do that nationally. So we are 93 hospitals over 22 states and a little over 100 senior living communities. And now I am regionalizing other markets. Our Trinity Health of New England market, 5 hospitals, only 2 of which were in the health system 2 years ago. So all of that becomes about the relationship building, but also I can tell you that we're 5 years in from our very large Trinity Health, Catholic Health East merger, and we had used some of that legacy language. Are you legacy from this organization or that organization? And we are past that. And now having my role, which is a senior vice president at Trinity, which was only created 7 months ago. It feels like years sometimes. We had an executive sponsor before, but what the challenge is that you don't have the same accountability. And I have a relationship with all of the CEOs in supervising all of the chief development officers, about 30 throughout the nation. So that was a big changer for us as well.
Absolutely. Well, so I think, in listening to the panel, when you think about these systems coming together, it presents both opportunities and challenges, right? And, you think about there's an opportunity to scale, as you mentioned, taking models nationally, but that also presents challenges. How do you do that? And when our group was together in November, I thought Randy and the rest of the group brought together a really interesting exercise, which was kind of this intersection between sort of culture and operations. And which one do you sort of privilege first? How do you pick the correct operating model? How do you drive the culture? Especially sometimes, as we discussed in philanthropy, the decision to brand at a central level may or may not be within your control. The decision to keep a brand less decentralized may or may not be in your control. So we want to kind of unpack a little bit more how you work within, again, either those constraints or the opportunities. So I'll kind of reverse order and turn this over to Fran to start.
Well, in our case, in this large national model, there was already a CEO directive to operationalize as regions, to do gift processing regionally, to talk about prospects regionally where they could overlap different markets that are geographically close. And so we were piggybacking with that, but frankly, sometimes philanthropy was leading when finance hadn't merged in a region. So that became big work for us. And I think that's a journey that we have now completed a fair amount of, and part of that was getting even on, as far as operationalizing a common donor platform, so that we can now do benchmarking together, so that we can now share best practices together. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So it's a lot going on. And to your point, I think it is interesting when sometimes philanthropy may be behind, again, not by choice, but then sometimes actually out in front, because as we talked in November, quite often you're the local representative. I mean, these large systems can become seemingly detached from, or I think people can feel in communities sometimes a little detached. But the philanthropic office, the presence of community relationship builders, volunteerism, often provides that connection back. So it is interesting depending on where you're fitting in that process.
I think sometimes we have to find a way to fit, and other times we have to find a way to lead, perhaps, and make sure that philanthropy is seen as a critical component of the organization. So a good example of that is early on in our merger, we determined that instead of just going through the motions with our associate giving campaign, we would rebrand it for the new system and pull from the Living Well component of the marketing strategy and call it the Give Well campaign, and use one time frame versus 2 time frames, merge all of the activities, and have the structure reflect the new norm for the system. Our hope was that philanthropy could then be seen as the culmination of bringing these 2 new different geographies, 2 different cultures together, and be celebrated in some way as a means of doing something new and different. But it also forced us to address some of those internal operating issues. Do we have 1 portal versus 2 portals? How are we coding these in our database? Well, that's all seamless to the donor, And how do we set the goal? Well, we set the goal where we thought would be just an arithmetic addition of the two sites or the two systems. And we set the goal at $3.5 million, and to our surprise, we raised over $6 million. So that then sets a very definite message to the rest of the leadership of this new organization that philanthropy is important. It's part of our culture, that we're a very giving society, and that we really do care deeply about the work that we're doing, and that there's passion behind the work that somehow builds that sense of competence and character that drives trust, that allows us to move more quickly with some of these other additions and changes that needed to be made.
And Armando?
So I wish my health system had been so thoughtful as my two partners, but I unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, I see it as a challenge. I inherited a health system that went through all of these mergers and acquisitions with no thought in mind about philanthropy. How many of you have health systems that sort of grew out without philanthropy really being at the table or thought about? So these health systems, my health system came together, and you know, God, let's not talk about the foundations because we don't want to disrupt the potential deal that we have on the table. If we bring the foundation conversation in, we may be losing all of that. So it was always put aside and left to future generations to be able to pick up the pieces and move forward with it. So Randy talked about trust, and that's where I am right now. Talk about baby steps moving forward. It's the development of trust among all of those foundations, those 11 existing foundations that totally were raising about $61 million last year. But how do you develop trust where we are, I representing the largest foundation in the central hub of Atrium Health, you know, how can I be a benefit to them? How can we work together to sort of lift all boats, to raise all boats at the same time, and have philanthropy become a piece of the conversation? So I'm in a very different spot than Randy and Fran in terms of this journey moving forward, but in a really exciting time, because I think that there's so many things that we can be doing. One of the things that I did last year is sort of a first step coming in, and is to develop a philanthropy summit where I brought in all of the various members of all of those foundations to have a conversation about what we need to do. How can we work together? Are there areas in which we can work together? Because remember, none of those foundations report up to me, right? So it's a very, very different approach, and it's going to take sort of those steps moving forward and developing the trust that Randy talked about.
And Armando, don't you think too, being when you are the flagship of it or you're the largest, you have an extra responsibility to demonstrate collaboration with all?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, in fact, I wasn't even hired to sort of take on this piece of the responsibility, because I think we have a new CEO, we have a whole new leadership suite. I mean, they're all very supportive of philanthropy, and I have a long relationship with the CEO. Actually, it dates back to coming together and working at MedStar Health at the Washington Hospital Center. Gene Woods and I, who was a past president of the American Hospital Association, started on the same week as I did. And we stayed in touch over all those years. And he said, well, can you come over here and help me with philanthropy? And so it was the right time. But we do have huge challenges in terms of what we need to do.
You know, I think another key point is in realizing that trust can be established much like any incremental strategy. So it's the competence and the integrity that we represent for the institutions that we each work with. And we do that through different ways. Being at a session like this, where you're learning from colleagues, having a network of professional influence that you can reach out to, having a CFRE or an FAHP, those are all marks of capability that then give you the authority to act on certain decision points. The integrity of knowing that there's ethics that we ascribe to and that there's value that represents. Beyond that, the value that then is illustrated through that competence. In our model, we have one central team for all of the 27 hospitals, but we are able to then have an attorney and a certified financial planner that are doing all of our estate plans for the entire system. So that's value that many of these standalone hospitals would not have previously, if not for this merger. So I think trying to help them understand that, yes, we're true and genuine to the individual relationships, but there's value and resources that you're also going to gain as being part of this broader system.
I think it's an excellent point. And one thing, and hopefully my panel will allow me a little liberty, because I didn't put this question on to send to them ahead of time, so I think you'll forgive me. But it touches on what you all said, is kind of that, often philanthropy is the local connection, you're building trust. I'm curious, when you're going through this process, if you have found that you didn't think you were at the right seat at the table. So in other words, there's a merger and acquisition happening, maybe philanthropy is kind of, not quite poised where you've got quite the voice that you need. What are some of the tactics or kind of approaches that you've taken in that journey to establish trust, to say, hey, actually, we do have to be included in that conversation? And the reason I bring this up, when we were together in November, part of the conversation was around when the local community is concerned or has questions about, a potential merger, it's often the board of the foundation that can actually help ease their minds, be an advocate. So just kind of curious if anybody could touch on that. Again, my apologies to the panel. It's not on the list.
No, I think that's very insightful. And early on, as part of our checklist, when we were integrating one hospital at a time, we always looked for those lead volunteers that could serve as champions for what this was going to mean for the rest of the community. And we latched onto those key champions and scripted them accordingly for each of the various meetings that they went to. So we were out in front of it and paving the way for a lot of the trust issues that we knew we were going to face. But I think in this merger, I wish we would have spent more time or had more time to anticipate some of those disruptions throughout the rest of the organizational structure. And I can say 1 year in that we have at least 4 instances where I know that the hospital president is either taken on more responsibility or moved to a different location, and that disrupts a relationship. And we didn't anticipate enough the impact that that would have philanthropically. Now we've got at least 4 donor stories that I can tell of one individual that said, I've seen 4 presidents in the last 4 years. I'm going to wait for the dust to settle before I give you my life savings, and feel that there's enough impact that will be resulted in the gift that I make. So don't underestimate the importance of that early work that you're doing in building intentional relationships with champions that could provide that reassurance to the rest of the community that you're working with.
And you definitely have to be face-to-face listening in that community. That was my learning. I went to every single hospital. You have to understand what that market is, what the patients are that are serving, and to your point, the foundation board and their top concerns. I spent a lot of my original 7 months presenting at foundation boards and talking about what Trinity Health is.
Right. Excellent point. So that really kind of being out in front. And again, I think a lot of this really comes back to the theme of trust, because operations are one thing, you can scale, they present their challenges, but people do drive the process. So what you say, culture is going to eat strategy. So if you don't have that, it's likely those challenges may get compounded. So another theme that, when we were putting together questions for this today that I thought would be interesting to touch on, and I like when threads kind of run together, is actually something Lisa touched on this morning, which is the idea of sort of disruptors in the market. So, a lot of times when we think about the mergers, the acquisitions, systems coming together, it has been traditionally providers. It's been health systems coming together. Well, now what we see, and kind of reinforced by this morning, it's disruptors. We actually have a customer I work with at Blackbaud who their system is now supplying the physicians as a pilot for Walgreens. They don't call them minute clinics, whatever the Walgreens version is of that, and got some feedback from donors about, wait a minute, you're a not-for-profit system, you're supplying physicians to a for-profit entity, what's going on there? So we wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of get views from the team. One, if there's been any of that in your own system, and then, do you foresee any challenges, or how does philanthropy continue to be, I don't want to say relevant, but sort of where is the place for philanthropy in kind of these new era of sort of this disruptive, more vertical merger? And whoever wants to start.
Well, I would just say that while we are not doing as much in the for-profit, nonprofit mergers, but there's 6 other large health systems in this room that are a part of a collaborative. It's now 800 signed up, but founding members of Civica RX, which is a nonprofit generic drug manufacturing company, and it was founded by CHI and Mayo and SSM and Providence St. Joe's and et cetera. But the point is we had these higher level, just as our speakers were talking about with Virginia Tech, and well, here's how we did it, because we all cared about that there was a common problem for patient populations we were willing to invest our organizational resources and Intermountain's another one. So yeah, that's an example of a good disruptor that I think we're open to now in a way that we weren't before.
Yeah, excellent point.
In Advocate, at least in Illinois, we do partner with Walgreens, so we are those one-minute clinics throughout most of the state.
I did not know that. Yeah.
But I think I go back to Lisa's visual of the layering of care, and we struggle with consumers versus patients. At a certain point of the relationship, it really is consumer-driven because it's price-sensitive. It's based on access. It's based on the reliability of the care and the quick access that they can get to. But at some point, it does transition to a patient relationship. So if we're able to get more patients that then see more than the brand, and it becomes a lifelong, loyal relationship with a caregiver that not just treats them when they're ill, but keeps them well during the course of their lifetime, then that's disrupting. And we've also realized that in this era, it's either disrupt or be disrupted. So why not get out in front of that with a value model that we can show that is building genuine relationships, and hopefully philanthropy would still be a part of that as opposed to healthcare just being a commodity. So I think it's intentional that we're thinking beyond the traditional realm, even in integrations. A good example is now we've got these vertical relationships around our pediatric service line. We used to have 2 children's hospitals, brought those 2 together. Now we're partnering with the University of Chicago as well as North Shore University Health System to really reflect on a pediatric service line for our broader footprint. So thinking in new ways is really going to be the normal in order to continue to thrive in the healthcare landscape.
Excellent point.
We partner as well with CVS, and so it's those relationships are beginning to be forged. But I think we can't forget what we're in the business for, and you addressed it in your presentation, and it's all about gratitude and relationships. And that's really the focus of the work that we really need to make sure that we are totally focused upon. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to advance the mission of our respective health systems, our respective hospitals. And that aspect of the relationship, what I'm most concerned about is as we're going through all this transitions, as we're becoming more efficient, right? As our physicians, we're asking our physicians to see more patients, and I see a lot of people nodding their heads. That relationship that existed, that relationship that developed the gratitude, we can't lose that aspect of what we do. There's going to be disruptors. What we need to figure out is that as these disruptions are coming on all around us, how do we maintain the civility of those relationships that forge gratitude that ended in a grateful patient gives? So disruptions are going to happen, and I think our world is going to be very, very different 10 years from now than it is today. I remember sitting in an advisory board meeting in Washington, D.C., where someone got up and spoke to us and said, 10 years from now, you're not going to be able to recognize yourselves. That was about 6 or 7 years ago. I can still recognize who we are, but we're certainly moving at a much faster pace.
Yeah. It's interesting to that end. When we, at Blackbaud, we did a study about this time last year, and we were kind of looking at sort of grouping health systems into cohorts, and not to elaborate on the study, but when we pulled data, fast forward a year later, we had over 70 of the organizations that actually moved cohorts, not because they had grown in size, but because of the mergers and acquisitions. And, when I talk with my colleagues, we represent, higher education, arts, all different sectors, and that's not exclusive to Blackbaud, just in general. I don't think there's another sector in the nonprofit world that has as much of sort of a dynamic change in the way the institute, I always laugh. I'm from South Carolina. You can probably tell, Clemson isn't buying the University of South Carolina and vice versa that I'm aware of. Right. That might cause, another issue in our state. I don't see that happening. But, so that's why I say, particularly in this sector, I think this topic is so important because it is not an easy one to navigate around. But again, I think what's so hopeful is, taking the trust factor, remembering, why we're here. It's that patient relationship. You can still form these wonderful relationships. And when you impact that, with someone that's been through a care episode, it's huge. It's so meaningful. Another question we kind of wanted to touch on, and then I think we've got some time for questions from the group here, is when you hear, and for lack of a better phrase, I'll say rumblings, or kind of that this is coming, because there's always a little bit of the scuttlebutt before, it hits the papers. One question we wanted to touch on is, what do? What's the first thing you think about in preparing for what may happen, whether it's, to Randy's point, two systems coming together, it's the acquisition of a hospital. Kind of what are some of your first steps when you say, okay, as the philanthropic leader, what's my first step to kind of get ready for that? Whoever, I'll point at Fran, we'll put you on the spot.
Well, I will just say it's a small community, and there's always the opportunity to have informal conversations to get to know each other, because otherwise there's this black box. You have an impression of someone else's brand, and it's not your brand, it's not your culture. So I think, you're not making any decisions, you're just getting to know each other. But there are professionals that you can reach out to and say, hey, have you heard anything about this? And tell me about your organization. I'll tell you about mine.
Yeah, that relationship building again. Yeah, absolutely.
So I know that it's likely to happen again. We are a $13 billion organization, and we, at our leadership meeting, learned that the intention is to double our size in the next 5 years. So I know that I will either work for one of you, or I welcome some of you as part of my team. And hopefully my resume illustrates my capabilities appropriately. In all seriousness, I think, as you've heard, it's just reaching out as soon as you know, or as soon as you have some rumblings, just in partnership to look at what they're doing differently. What I've typically done is just called the person and said, I know you're doing this really well. Can we learn from that? And that sparks the relationship, because if they're giving you something, then you're already starting with a trusting relationship. And well, what can we then provide in return? And just using that as an exchange, much like, last night. They had to turn the lights off on us before we left our tables, right? Because we love to share, we love to learn from each other, and I think if that's where it starts, you can only envision what possibilities exist if you continue with that energy.
Well, again, being that we're just in the process of going through a new merger and acquisition, which I can't talk about necessarily because it's in the process, but this is the first one that, since I've been there, actually the second one, where I've been at the table having conversations, being at the table with the CEO, being at the table with, I'm at the table, I'm part of the CEO team or council, but being there to provide the perspective of how do we manage the philanthropic relationship. And so that's been the big difference, that moving forward, I can play a much more important part than my predecessors did prior to my arrival.
Yeah, it's really important. So again, it's not to sort of over-summarize, but it really does come down to the relationships. And I like the idea of being able to Fran, to your point, Randy, reaching out informally, starting to establish that even long before some of the agreements are more formalized, or whatever the case is. Because I think too, what you see in this room is quite often they're announced. I'm thinking about some specific situation, and then it's a year and a half. Well, what you don't want to do if you have the opportunity to talk is miss that window to start these relationships. Because I think we also always know when that happens, when the final paperwork is complete, it's sort of game on. So, you're really starting behind if you haven't been able to start some of those relationships ahead of time. So I think now we've got some time for questions from the audience. We wanted to make sure, again, given the group we have up here, that we'll start with John back there. Yeah.
How have you incentivized, after a merger, even within the system, how have you incentivized shops to work together? Let's say you both want to go, you've got a project you think that it's going to be great for AT&T. So we're going to have your foundation and your foundation. You're going to get 100,000 of it, and you're going to get 250,000 of it. So it's a $350,000 combined ask. How have you incentivized those people? Because they're going to have to do the work together, they're going to have to do the stewardship together, and who gets to count the gift? And how does it count toward, you've got a goal, you've got to raise $1.5 million this year, you've got to raise $3 million this year. How have you parsed that so you incentivize cooperation, not competition?
We've done that a little bit with, you might have common physician practices among multiple hospitals, so we've presented joint requests and gotten much bigger dollars than any of those individuals. It sort of was a self-fulfilling. And similarly with corporate and foundation, again, we can all agree on donor-centric. The donor's going to decide what's meaningful to them. Right. And I think when we approach it that way, people are able to talk through it.
And that's exactly what we do. We actually, if there's a common prospect, we'll pull the teams together and say, okay, let's look at this from the donor's perspective. What is it that they're asking of us? And how can we be genuine to that relationship and start there first? Because many times, in fact, I think in every instance that I'm aware of, that's where those issues are resolved. And then it develops into a strategy where there are natural partners, and of course you've got a couple gift officers with relational history and components that play into that strategy, and they should be involved in the overall solicitation with that individual. As far as credit, we're all in from the incentive standpoint at a system number, and we don't incent others for site numbers aside from their key result areas or aside from dollars raised per professional FTE. So we'll count it towards those numbers where credit is due, but when it's to the total number, it's all comprehensive.
Another question? So one up front, one in the back, so we'll go to the back and then here. Or maybe we're going to the front first. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Question for you. As you bring together these foundations, you're bringing together professionals who are really passionate about the foundations that they're currently working in. Knowing that there's not a silver bullet, what was the one thing that you did in these acquisitions or mergers to kind of bring the team together that made you walk away and be like, okay, we're going to do that again? What was that thing?
Have fun. So the one example that I'll use is we actually had a donor that made a gift, and it's a former staff person from our foundation that when she left, she said, I want to make a gift, but I want it to go towards the donut fund, because she felt that people always got together over food and had more fun and built relationships over donuts. So we didn't use it for donuts. Instead, what we did early on in our integration, we found a Cubs Brewers game. So we've got Illinois Cubs fans, you've got the Wisconsin Brewers fan, and we bussed the entire foundation team up to a baseball game. And we just got together and had fun. We did tailgating before the game. We made some different hats and frames where people can take pictures and Instagrammed all that fun stuff. But anything that you can do around those types of efforts that don't necessarily require a great deal of resources, I think that builds a culture pretty quickly and helps people understand that these are people just like them, that they really do want to be a part of what this new system is going to achieve. And anything that would raise the sites beyond the pitfalls and potholes that are the day-to-day distractions from the horizon, and just raise the sites around the opportunity that this is going to generate. I mean, what does it mean to be, instead of a 14-hospital system, now to be a top 10 healthcare foundation? And what does it mean to be a part of something like that? And how can you illustrate that and generate some energy around that? I think those are all key factors that played into where we are now.
Just the Philanthropic Summit that I put together was a terrific way to bring people together. I surveyed them prior to them coming, so we got to focus on the things that was most important, what was top of mind for them, give us an opportunity to socialize as well as part of that and break bread. So it was a wonderful opportunity to sort of get to know what was most top of mind, what were the biggest issues, what are the biggest challenges, and then develop those that particular day-long summit around what was most important to them. I thought that was a terrific way.
I think go ahead.
Well, we've since formed cross-functional teams to really tackle some of the more difficult issues, like one database versus two, or one foundation versus two, or simple practices that we know need to be enhanced. Just because of our density model, we're relatively consolidated, so there are some synergies that we should be able to leverage. So we've got teams that are reflective of both geographies as well as a variety of skill sets or advance in their career. So it's building the skill set of the team while they're also contributing to the work that affects the outcomes.
I was just going to say, from a change management perspective, an exercise that we would often do when we would get people together is you need to let people exercise their fears. There is loss in mergers. There is loss of culture in mergers, and you need to be able to allow that to be shared. And also, but you can often get to a shared vision because they start to hear, oh, they have a grant writer, oh, they have a great plan giving model like Randy was talking about. And then people are able to themselves articulate, I could see a vision where together we would be stronger, but not without skipping the step of saying, you know, I've been in this organization for 10 years and I've always, you know, had this culture and I'm worried that I'm going to lose that.
That's a fair point. I had the opportunity to attend the Common Spirit sort of philanthropy conference, and what struck me there is day one, not to speak for Shannon or Fred, they're building culture with that organization, and then they had both CEOs there, and I thought that was sent just to the whole of the philanthropic organization, such an important message of how valued people are and how important it is to have people come together. So I think we have time for one more question. Oh, we have more than one, I'm sorry. So go ahead.
Jared Lane Kildee with Honor Health Foundation in Scottsdale, Arizona. Thank you for picking this topic and discussing these matters because they're very relevant to all of us. Paige, my question for you really is from Blackbaud's perspective with this national trend of merger and acquisitions. What do you see happening with the data and the databases, how each organization keeps them? From behind the scenes, there's a lot of challenges there because everyone does it a little differently, and you guys are the big dog in the room with respect to the databases.
Absolutely. Well, I'll answer that, and I'll give you kind of just a couple of points. One, I think we have to be the best partner we can be, period, because when you look at, I mean, just represented on the stage here, we've got 3 different models, and so one thing I'm committed to along with my team is we don't want to force fit a model to someone just because we think, oh, it's this product. So we need to understand, is it centralized, is it decentralized, what's the best fit? In addition to that, I was talking a little bit with Alice last night and over conversations with the HSPLG operations group, if I get that correct, with this, the refresh of the standards manual, the ability to kind of infuse that information into best practices when you're using a database. I think there's excellent opportunity to partner there as well, because candidly what we hear the most common is a lot of the size and the scales of these new systems, it's unprecedented. We don't necessarily have a model for the best way to do it. It doesn't mean that we haven't found some of that at this point, but we do know through the, I'll call it the refresh, I think that's the appropriate term, but the refresh of the standards manual, starting to understand a little more of the complexity of the different systems, I think we can start to snap some of those things together and say, okay, what's the best fit for this organization? But conversely, what can we learn from other organizations that have gone ahead? And that's really our take on this right now. I would say the number one thing we get asked is what's the best practice? And so another piece that I'm really committed to, again, along with my team, is to work to be a convener so we can have those conversations, because you can make a database do just about anything you want to. That's generally, I say just about, I'm sure people are like, well, I wish it would do this. But that aside, you can kind of make it do just about anything you want to. And what we want to do is partner with our customers, partner with AHP to make sure we're picking, again, I'll say at a high level, the right way to do it, so that, I dream of a world if you have 2 systems come together where, wow, they're coding gifts the same way per the standards manual. They have it in the same place. I mean, that's kind of nirvana, but that's my take on it, so I hope that's helpful. Time for one more. We're out. I didn't check time. So one more? Okay, so one more question. I think there was one right here if I put you on the spot. Yeah, we'll get in the microphone. Thanks, Maddie.
Hi, I'm Damien, and board member. I'm looking at it from the other perspective, and always look at how managing upwards. So can you talk about the cultural challenges of bringing 2 separate boards together to come to one common mission, and I kind of heard it as I was at some of the events last night and today. I hear different philosophies and approaches and passions, but they may not always align. So can you talk about how you're managing upwards to engage those board members and bring them together to be champions too?
Go ahead.
So in our case, I don't think the merger would have happened if the board members from either entity weren't aligned. And I think finding a similarity in makeup or shared purpose, I think, is critical to the level of engagement of those board members, as well as the depth of what you're able to achieve in aligning the organization towards a vision for what this will look like. So it's not just, in our case, Illinois and Wisconsin. This is where healthcare is headed. Here's what we're doing to transform it. let's find some like partners that think like us and are right there with us with some of these tough decisions that need to be made. And first, thank you for your volunteer leadership and the insight that you're providing as a board member, because that is so critical in each of the organizations that we represent. But it's also the understanding that when they take on these roles, each of you, it's also understanding how nimble we need to be and how agile and creative we need to be in making some of these very difficult decisions around aligning new cultures, aligning new geographies, building synergistic models that can affect care. And really, that's what this is about. If we're going to transform healthcare, it's everything from care models to the geography that we represent to where it's accessed, whether it's the Walgreens or a traditional big box, whether it's the acuity of care, whether it's, do I need stitches or do I need an ICU? So all of those factors play into just aligning the vision of the volunteer leadership in what mission they're looking to serve, and is their shared purpose that can be illustrated and advanced in a quicker fashion through this alignment.
I think the piece that I would say on that is just that I recognize with the foundation boards in particular, there's a lot of emotion because they have their heart into it. And I'm picturing a donor who's, a second generation donor. His dad was the board chair of the prior hospital. They're getting merged. But as long as I think that's acknowledged and again, that common vision is built together, it does work. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts, ideas, insights. It's, on a personal level, I get to work with you, see all of you. It's a privilege. And thank you all for your great questions. Appreciate it.